We're getting into our conversation for this hour, and we'll be talking about refugee placements and solidarity with refugees and enhancing refugees integration. Jamin Kasuania has been in the studio with us before. Is not a stranger to the Situation Room, and he's sitting in the hot seat this morning as an advocacy manager with the International Rescue Committee. Jamin, good morning.
Good morning. Good to be back here after some time.
Good to see you again.
To have discussions about refugees and how we can be able to build solidarity. Indeed.
Consistency of that is very important. Joined today by Dorris Kawira, and she is the Hias Kenya country director and co-chair of the NGO Refugee Group. Lovely to have you here this morning as well.
Thank you. It's
Karibu
good
sana.
to be here this morning.
So, welcome you to this conversation, welcome you into the hot seats of the Situation Room, and we're looking at something that's very vital and critical when it comes to folks who are living in our communities and sometimes, more times than not, unregarded. But as we get into that, City is going to welcome you in true fine Situation Room fashion with today's proverb.
Yes, our proverbs for the whole of this week ending Friday, our proverbs are from the Republic of Mauritius, the island Republic of Mauritius. A hen cannot lay eggs and hatch them all on the same day.
Dorris, how would you interpret that?
I think it takes time to do something, to get somewhere. It doesn't happen at the same time, and therefore there's a process that has to take place. Yeah, that's how I would interpret it.
Indeed. What about you, Jamin?
I mean, perfectly know that we have to believe on the process. We have to know it's a journey. I think what we actually see in that, there must be the laying of the eggs before the hatching of it.
Yes.
So we must be doing something if we're going to see the chicks by the end of the day.
There you go.
Is that not true of life?
It lands. It lands
Now,
very...
when you see an outcome, there was a process that led to it.
Exactly.
Yes, it didn't happen when you looked at it. I mean, what you're seeing is the end product. But before the end product, there was something else that took place.
Something absolutely had to be birthed.
Yes.
That's true. Okay, so we're getting into, and it's interesting because we're talking about solidarity with refugees. Maybe we can start off with you, Jamin. Yes. And when we talk about solidarity with refugees and then, just making sure that the status is one that is characterized with as much, genuineness as possible, what are we saying here? Essentially, one would argue that by virtue of the fact that you have refugees, we've already regarded you. So why are we saying that there needs to be more solidarity with them?
Thank you. Today, 20th June, is always a commemoration of World Refugee Day.
Yeah.
And so the theme for this particular year is solidarity with refugees, a world where refugees are welcomed. And when we speak about solidarity, then we look at the situations that refugees have had in terms of the displacement aspect. We look at the situations that they have within the countries of displacement and ask the question, are they included socially and economically? Do they feel part and parcel of the society? Are we acknowledging their rights to livelihoods? Are we acknowledging the rights to documentation? Are we acknowledging the right for coexistence? And so the clarion call for solidarity with refugees is acknowledging the huge barriers that they face at the countries where they have actually run to, and seeing how can we be able to make betterment of the lives that they are at the countries where they have run to. It is an acknowledgement. Warren Shira, the poet, in the year 2009, says that nobody runs from home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And so the solidarity with refugees is actually saying that how can we make home for refugees at the places where they have run to.
Question that I need to ask.
Yes.
Clearly, this stems from a point of view where, from what you're saying, you're insinuating that refugees have rights. What are these rights?
I can go. The refugee situation is as old as mankind. I give this analogy many times, that when your house burns, the very first thing you'll do, you rush to the neighbor. When you rush to the neighbor, you expect that the neighbor will welcome you with their hands and then will ask you, why are you coming here? or they will not tell you, why did you not knock when you're actually walking in? And so this is a very old aspect. What in law we would say it's a jus cogens, that there are things that happen within the community even without there being a framework for it to be able to happen. But the codifications of laws in terms of who refugees are and what rights they can be able to get dates back to 1951. But even beyond that, during the First World War and the Second World War, when we were having huge number of refugees, it became important for us to be able to solidify and say people have a right to asylum. And so dating back to 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, just after the Second World War, there was that particular acknowledgement. But then what rights then do refugees have? Refugees have right to documentation, that we can then be able to identify them. We can't have people that then are not documented. Secondly, they have rights to be able to access livelihood and economic opportunities so that they can be able to fend for themselves. They have the right to be able to engage in wage-earning employment and build their communities and that. And the very cornerstone of it, that they have the right to be accepted within the territories and the countries where they have actually are. And so the call for solidarity is the call on all those particular fronts: their documentation, their right to work, their right to livelihood, their access to the territory, which is the country where we have. And Kenya as a country has actually hosted refugees for more than 3 decades right now. I think the biggest bulk of it coming from 1991. And we continue to champion and call for the need for us to make sure we avail the environment in a way that they can be able to feel home, they can be able to generate income for themselves, they can be able to be part and parcel of the economy.
Okay.
What steps do we take, or what steps are taken so that countries understand this? So that when you have refugees in your country, you have a framework, you have an understanding of what it is and how it is. You need to treat them and how you need to manage their affairs.
Thank you, Muga. When we talk about what steps we need to take, it starts with the small steps. Like you were saying, the analogy of the hen laying eggs, it starts with that analogy is what you do as an individual, as you open your space, as an entrepreneur, as you offer job opportunities to refugees. It starts with you as an individual. It starts with Kenya as a country, and Kenya has done a good job at opening the doors for refugees. But then beyond Kenya opening the doors, beyond us changing and having progressive laws and policies, it goes down to the individuals. Remember, the refugees live with us in the society. They are here with us. Their children go to school with our children. They go to seek for medical care within the hospitals that are there in the community. And so the steps that are taken at different levels, we have steps that are taken by the government. The government needs to look at the policies, and I would laud the Kenyan government for the Refugee Act, the Shirika plan that talks about integration of refugees and really expounds on that concept of what integration would look like so that it benefits the Kenyans and the refugees, but also going down to institutions, talking about refugees, breaking down the misconceptions that are there about refugees, that a refugee is someone who's come to take your place, to take the jobs that are here. No, understanding who is a refugee and being in solidarity with refugees all the way even to our communities, our children, that they are with refugees in schools and they go to school together. And so the way I look at it is that the steps that need to be taken really is a whole of society approach, where everyone is involved in the discussions and in the process of the steps that need to be taken to welcome and open the door for refugees.
Perhaps in a search of a further understanding as to how solidarity can then be built for refugees in our communities, wherever we are around the world, then it's probably necessary to have a prior understanding of what happened that then established the tenets under which refugees would be accepted from country to country. And I just remember in my international humanitarian law classes where we looked at a lot of these issues coming about as a result of war, conflict, and that is how you have established cases of refugees in the first place. And that there were certain protocols and treaties then that the world came together using the bodies of the United Nations through the Geneva Protocols and things like this, whereby that you had an establishment of treaties that would then be ratified by certain countries, yes? Mm-hmm. And that is how we established and said, you know what, different countries, then we're going to open it up and say, yes, take in refugees. Countries who ratified these treaties then said this will be a safe space where they can live and do these things, Jamin, that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Have access to proper documentation, wage earning, etc., etc. That seems to be very brick and mortar policy. Mm-hmm. We've ratified it, so we've agreed on the world stage that this will happen. But has it really filtered down into society, whereby then we see the things that Dorris is talking about, where communities then have to make sure that at your immigration departments, are you making sure you're actually getting this documentation for these folks? Are you making sure that they can earn a wage with the necessary identification that they need? Are those things actually happening beyond the hoity-toity policy and the real situation on the ground?
Thank you. I would say we have made significant progress in terms of having the policies in place and what needs to be done in terms of the countries domesticating some of these particular provisions. I would acknowledge the place of policy in terms of trying to create direction for the implementation of these particular processes. The Kenyan government has recently, 2021, actually come up with a Refugee Act of 2021 that looks at how then can we be able to integrate refugees in the realization of the context where we are at. Having hosted refugees for the last 30 years, then the Kenya situation is a protracted situation. And so the very beginning, people would think that refugees would come and after 2 years, they will go back home. But what we are seeing that after 30 years, the realization of the Kenyan government was that the act that we had, the 2006 Refugee Act, then is not adequate enough to be able to deal with the refugee situation that we have and that we have been having for the last 30 years. And so it looks at how then do we integrate them. It's speaking about how do we enhance the right to work. It's speaking about how do we ensure that we have documents issued at the national and even at the county level. It actually acknowledges the role of county governments in the provision of services to refugees. Previously, this function was entirely the responsibility of national government. And so the act in place, and now what Dorris spoke about, the Kenyan government has realized that there is actually a need to develop what we call a Shirika plan, which is a plan about how do we integrate them in society.
Right.
How do we ensure that our education system, for instance, they actually go to the schools that we go, as Dorris has said, the education system that we definitely have. And so when you look at the vagaries of that cause displacements, as Ntu is saying, they have changed over time. Yes, civil war is one of the main reasons why people actually move, but we're beginning to see climate change. And so we're having climate displacement actually happening. What happened in the last 2 years in Somalia and the rest of the places, we have people moving away because of this. And our laws have actually acknowledged that matters seriously disturbing public order are issues that can be able to make people move from one particular border to the other. We are yet to see the entire implementations of these particular policies. We are yet to see the documents that will ensure that they are able to work in this particular country, the work permits that are required for refugees. We are yet to see the access to services for refugees from the county government, for instance. We are yet to see the inclusion in development plans in the country. Yes, 2019 during the census, yes, they were counted within that. But then how then do we plan with them, because they're actually populations within the country? At the very community level, we have a level of understanding of host communities about refugees and what their plights are, but we still have a lot to do in terms of how they feel or take them as part and parcel of community without looking at them as people coming to take up opportunities that would belong to them. Yes.
Okay. Looking at the community level, because when we talk about solidarity, usually that's not a word that we apply to government. When we talk about solidarity, we apply that word to community, isn't it? Are we essentially saying that be your brother's keeper when it comes to accepting that these are people who might be here for a long time? I know Kenyans today, for example, who have grown up with refugees from the time that they were children. And we're not talking about folks who reside in camps, people who've actually come and lived in communities. And it's like they've been here all their lives, really. So what solidarity are we talking about when we say there must be solidarity for refugees in host countries? Are we talking about then along communities of people?
Thank you. When we talk about solidarity, we are talking about the government as well and the communities of people as well. The government has a role to play, a critical role in terms of solidarity. When we talk about solidarity with opening the boundaries, it is only the government that can allow to open the boundaries and to welcome refugees, and that's the part of the government. But then when we talk about solidarity in the community, we are emphasizing even the notion of Ubuntu that we have, togetherness, that if your neighbor comes to you, they are in need, that you offer support to them. And that's the solidarity we are talking about when we talk about solidarity in the community, that we are looking at employers who are within the community. The refugees are able to earn wages through the informal employment, and research has shown that refugees, most of the refugees are in the informal sector, and therefore solidarity means that when you employ a refugee in the informal sector, that you are able to give them proper wages, not to undercut their wages. So solidarity in the community really would look at all aspects, but also key is the government, because then documentation would come from the government and recognition. Yeah.
But again, when you talk of solidarity, what is our reference point? Are we buttressing, are we supporting, are we renewing, revisiting the frameworks that already exist? Are we creating new ones? Because if we talk about building it, there is a quiet implication that what we have isn't quite adequate, or there's implication that it isn't there, and so we need to start from scratch. Which is it?
It's been there. Solidarity has been there, and that's why Jamin said that we've had refugees in this country even before the 2006 Refugee Act. And what we are talking about is a shift in how we look at refugees. Currently, if you look at this country, we have the encampment policy where refugees are based in 2 refugee camps. That's Dadaab and Kakuma. But then we are talking about shifting how we look, our outlook of how we look at refugees. Do we have refugees in the camps, or do we have then refugees in integrated settlement? And that's why we are talking about integration, because we have looked at refugees from the angle of people who need humanitarian assistance, but then it's coming out that that's not sustainable. The money that goes to humanitarian assistance is not sustainable anymore. Why not inject that money into the economy, and then it helps the refugee and the host community? And so we are looking at it from a higher angle, that we move away from really saying that yes, we have opened our doors and we have refugees here. Beyond that, integrating them, instead of having teachers that teach only in refugee schools, integrating them in our schools, instead of having hospitals that are only for refugees, having host communities access those hospitals. So it's looking at it even from an economic angle and what is sustainable, really.
Indeed.
And even when we have the whole aspect of solidarity, we are calling on everybody. We're calling on donors to be able to contribute more towards development, because we have contributed, as Dorris is saying, towards humanitarian assistance. How can we be able to skill them more? They have no. How can we be able to avail digital platform where they can be able to contribute in the whole aspect of the society? We're looking at solidarity from the media. Do media highlight refugee stories of resilience and their contribution to the economy? Hardly. And so when you look at the stories and the version where we speak about refugees, actually the needy people, they require help. But there are those that are doing significant aspects to contribute to the economy. And those living in urban areas, even providing employment to even Kenyans. And so private sector, media, donors, community, government, everybody has a role to play as we move towards seeing how we can be able to have a betterment to the refugee population that we host. This is a call that we are making within our context of the country, but also the call that we are making globally based on the huge number of displaced people that we continue to see year in, year out.
So it's not just Ethiopia and its refugees. It's not just Kenya and its refugees. It's not just, other countries around the world and the refugees, but it's a collective global conversation. How so?
The conversation about the refugee situation has grown over the last few years. For decades, it had taken a backseat, and it looked like it was going to be an African problem. Until we began having then situations in Europe and other calamities in Ukraine and other particular places. And the world then decided to take this particular matter now more seriously. In 2019, we had then the Global Compact for Refugees. And it realized that we need to do more than what we have been doing. It began to realize there's a need for us to look at how do we support host governments that are actually having the largest number of refugees. So there's a need to support the host government. It also acknowledged that we need to be able to see how, as we program for refugees, how do we also program for the host communities? Because more often than not, about 70% of people who have actually been displaced to other particular countries are within developing countries. And so those particular countries on themselves also have needs that they need to be able to cater. And the situation of the host community, they are almost similar to those. So how can we be able to support both host communities and refugees at the same time? But the biggest call in solidarity that I see is that instead of us having a response aspect, is the prevention aspect. That then how can we be able to prevent crises from happening? The crises that are actually leading to displacement. How can we be able to work on aspects of climate change that are actually causing displacement, the biggest population now? So at the very global stage, then these are the conversations in terms of what is the role of everybody of us in the same. What is the role? And when you see the call from the United Nations Secretary General, is that we all need to, the globe needs to have solidarity to rebuild the lives of these particular people. Year in, year out, we begin to see new crises happening and new number of people being displaced. And so if this particular trend then continues, we are not at the end of the displacement and the refugee situation that we are actually having. The donors, how can we then have donors step in to support in rebuilding the lives of those that have been displaced? So it has two elements. It has the element of prevention. How have you building solidarity to be able to prevent crisis? But also how have you building solidarity for those that have already been displaced so that we can be able to rebuild their life at the countries where they are in terms of the aspects of integration, and even preparing them to go back for reintegration and repatriation in the countries where they actually came from. Because nobody wants to run and be across that particular border. Everybody wants to be home. I tell people many times, growing up in the villages, you were very happy when you went visiting your aunties and your uncles, but you didn't want to stay there for long because you don't feel that you are home. And so even this particular population also wants to go back home. They want to repatriate. The situation needs to be a situation that can be able to warrant return.
So how then would you measure success? Okay, you have this plan. This is what you want to do. You want to support the host country. You want to support the refugees. From the point of view of what the two of you do, what does one need to see in order to understand that, yes, what we set out to achieve, we can actually see the progression and we can actually see ourselves achieving it? What is it?
Three things. The very first one is, if we are able to get social cohesion at the community level, that we have the acceptance of the communities where refugees reside as part of their brothers and sisters, for me at the very community level, then that is a level of success. The second is the integration of refugees within the national systems. How refugees are integrated in access to services at the both national and at the county level, as again a measure of success. Their participation in development, their participation in governance, us budgeting them within that is a key aspect of that. The third aspect is about the policy aspect. If our policies are able to ensure that refugees can be able to move from one point to the other to access their opportunities, that's a measure of success. If government departments, their systems, our e-citizens, our different platforms allow refugees to be able to participate in that, it's a measure of success for me. So what we have been asking for many years, and I think this has gotten traction over the last few years, is that refugees do not want to be dependent. They are saying, open the system for us. integrate us in your communities, integrate us in your policies, integrate us within your development plans, and we can be able to fend for ourselves, we can be able to provide for our communities.
And I think it speaks to self-reliance. One of the key aspects of the Global Compact for Refugees that was passed in 2018 was moving away from relying on donor aid to self-reliance, and self-reliance really would be the overarching. The refugees are able to rely on themselves, not rely on aid that comes to them. I think that one would be a key in terms of measuring success for refugees, that we don't have World Food Program giving aid to refugees or food rations to refugees. They're able to get work and integrate in the community. Then for us, that would be very key in terms of measuring the success of what we are doing. Yeah.
Talking of refugees, we always think of people crossing borders. What when you have internally displaced people? How do we measure success? Because the assumption would be, well, integrate them back. But remember, there's a reason why they left wherever it is that they were living before. So the discussion that you mentioned about trying to ensure that whatever it is that caused that movement has been prevented. These things that you do to ensure this, what are they?
For the internally displaced people, the push factors that will lead to IDPs are also different. And so some people would move because of drought, some people would move because of floods and some such circumstances. And so each particular push factor then has a different aspect of intervention and what particular success would look like. Flood victims, then we would look at how then the success of that is that then the next time, then we do not have people displaced by the same calamities. How do people move to new particular heights? If it's about conflict and wars, how do we have then conversations in terms of what are the root causes of those particular conflicts and wars that we're having? But in the country, you realize that most of the displacements, even when the push factors look different, access to resources is actually a key aspect of the same. And so we can't do this particular alone, again, even on that particular front. So how are county governments addressing those particular drivers for displacement? How are we creating opportunities in those particular communities? If communities have been working on livestock, for instance, is their only main source of livelihood, how can we be able to have integrated agriculture in those particular communities? And so the success for IDP displacement would be what is the push factor, and then how do we address them? Many of them, which are actually resource conflict that we are having, it is the role of the legislators in terms of CDF. How do we educate more of those particular people? How do we ensure that they have alternative levels of livelihood? Now with county government, how do we even concentrate in those particular situations?
One that might be controversial here, but is a reality, is that you want to ask the question about host nations who take up refugees, ratified to do so because you said you would agree to, are often battling with their own internal resource issues. How do you then say increase or even make existing bandwidth a little bit more elastic to take in extra? Because that's what it is. It's going to be a battle for resources. It's going to be a competition of priority. That do we focus on the things that, if you talk about health, make sure health is available to your people, and you're saying already there's a struggle for the nation and its internal responsibility. And then here you are saying, take a little bit of that bandwidth and stretch it some more in this direction to take in folks who are not, indigents. This is it. This is true. It may sound harsh, it may sound callous, but it is the case. That already there is a struggle internally, economically, for a lot of these host nations that are taking in refugees. How do you then expand your bandwidth to accommodate and say, here we are urging you a little bit more to then do 1, 2, 3, 4 for communities that are not inherently yours?
I think when we talk about solidarity, there's an aspect that Jamin talked about, calling upon the donors and the development agencies in terms of easing pressure for the host countries. And that is one of the key pillars, again, of the Global Compact on Refugees, that looking at the host countries, is there support that's going to the host countries? And therefore, looking at it from the angle of, instead of pumping in a lot of money on on humanitarian response, can we have development agencies? And recently we've seen the World Bank coming in and funding a lot of development aspects going into Garissa and Dadaab, and also in the urban areas. And so is looking at who else we are calling for solidarity, the development agency, the international communities, the third countries really to come in and do their part when we talk about easing pressure into the host community, that when you put up institutions that they are not only supporting refugees, they are benefiting the host community. Because when we look at a majority of refugees where they are hosted, Dadaab and Kakuma, poorest counties in the Aso region, affected by climatic changes. And so what we are saying is, instead of giving food rations to this one person, why don't we have development agencies coming, constructing the road that's been constructed to Turkana, and that really opens up the county, it opens it up and benefits the refugees and the host community. When you put up schools, let the children in Turkana access those schools, and that's what we are saying, because a lot of money that is going to humanitarian aid really is only going to support the basic needs, food, clothing, shelter. But then beyond that, then we need to look at it from really what is the international community doing to support the host country. And that is why we are saying even solidarity for the international community, for that countries, and for development agencies.
Do you see apprehension, may I ask? Is there apprehension from what you've seen? Because you engage with policy, you engage at that level. Do we see apprehension, or close to even calling it fear, to say, well, how far can we integrate without any kind of, harm on systems?
We are beginning, Kenya is at a different vantage position because of the length of time that we have hosted refugees. And so there's an acceptance that, yes, the route to go is how do we not build parallel systems? How do we ensure that they are part and parcel of the community? When you go to regions like in Turkana and in Garissa, they even say, if you are providing humanitarian assistance, we also require humanitarian assistance for our people. And so it's better when we have the conversation about development and creating opportunities in those particular localities. The question about apprehension is something that we are not seeing in many of those particular cycles. They are beginning to recognize the value add that refugees actually have in the communities and societies that we are in. When we see refugees creating, for instance, employment opportunities for refugees in urban areas, then the community begins to see the value of actually having refugees in this particular context. When you see development actors coming out to say that, okay, because we are hosting refugees, we want to ensure that we develop a level 4 hospital, for instance, in Dadaab, the sub-county, for both host and refugee communities, then they begin to appreciate that this particular intervention is not just an intervention towards refugees, but an intervention again towards the host community. The very realization of the reasons why people flee and why we have the situation that we have in the country has been a key aspect in trying to lessen the apprehension issues. People have realized that any one of us then can actually be a refugee. I think 2007 was actually a point of reasoning for a majority of Kenyans that, you know what, everybody then can be a refugee. Then how would we want to be accorded if we moved to another particular country?
Right.
Would we want to stay in a refugee camp with limited education, been given food and handouts day in, day out? And so that realization has actually helped build both at the community level in terms of aspects of cohesion, but even policymakers on their understanding that let's see how we can then be able to integrate this particular population. We're not asking for a lot. We're not asking for a quota system that this percentage need to go to them towards this, but then let them be able to be in an environment where they can contribute taxes, where they can be able to support their own families and communities.
The progress that we speak of, do we have places on this planet where what we're saying is an aspiration? Are there places where it has actually been done? Where you can say, what we're saying, for instance, it's been done here, and this was the outcome of the initiative.
We definitely have. Among the what we would call durable solutions, because how then do we end this particular issue of refugee? Integration is actually just one of them. where then we would speak how do you integrate them into the system. And the very hallmark of integration is actually citizenship. Then they become the citizens of the country where they come from. But then we have many third countries that pursue the other particular aspect of resettlement. So they pick refugees from here, they got them to Germany, to US, and they make them citizens of those particular countries. And so that then definitely have been pursued. When we look at what the third aspect, before I mentioned that, is actually the aspect then of repatriation, how people can go back home and they can see how they can be able to coexist. We are seeing significant aspects for refugees, for instance, in Turkey, and the access to services and government systems. And you will note that Turkey has like one of the biggest global populations of refugees. We way back in terms of the contribution in that, City will agree with me that the number of people displaced from Germany, the Jews displaced from Germany into US in the 30s, they have actually been able to be key pillars in the economy of the state and that. And so we have examples that given the opportunity for this particular population, for them to be able to use their skills and their creativity and that, then it's a beneficial aspect to the communities where we definitely are having. We have countries that have succeeded in trying to provide citizenship to people over a period of time. And I think as a country, my take would be, even as we move towards aspects of integration, currently the Kenyan government is looking at social and economic integration. But then we can be able to get even into the citizenship aspect of integration, even if we begin looking at how long have people been in the country. Because if we have been having someone born here for the last 30 years they've been here, then there is a possibility that the only durable solution that could make sense ultimately could be integration and citizenship. What we have done to the Makontes and the Pempas, then being stateless for a long period of time, could be what we could work with over time. And Kenya as a country could begin looking at, okay, maybe in the next decade, they are saying those that have been in the country for more than 35 years, then we can do something to ensure that we pursue aspects of the durable solution.
So, Dorris, what would be markers that we would look at to say low-hanging fruit, whether it is in the short term, mid-term, long-term, that we can say, yeah, we can pick this one and put it in the basket because that one has been done. What would be some of those things that we can say, yes, then we are at least approaching where we are going?
Some of them are integration into the national systems, the medical insurance scheme, National Hospital Insurance Fund, and therefore you don't have to have parallel pathways of access to medical care. Work permits as well, because we have a young workforce within the refugee population. So access to employment and access to work permits is another low, if you ask me, a low-hanging fruit, really that would be a marker. We already have refugees engaged in the workforce, and what we are saying is enhance that a little bit. The other one we are talking about really is integration into our education system, and we have seen very progressive policies that looks at integration of the refugee children accessing the system, recognition of the document, registration document that we have that really builds on refugees accessing all the other services. And so those are some of the low-hanging fruits that would see as progress, and that we are seeing as progress even as we move into being in solidarity with refugees. Yeah.
You know, sometimes I get a little confused when I think of people seeking refugees and people who immigrate. Because somehow the difference seems to be, in some cases, people who actually have a certain level of education and maybe skills which enables them to be easily integrated into other countries. Now, what is it that we see as the future, the preventative future of this situation of refugees? When I say future, I mean this. All the things that we mentioned happening, let me leave war aside. I'm thinking of a county in Kenya like, say, Isiolo, where you find the Somalis, you find Samburu, you find Turkana, you find Borana. It's an interesting mix. And you can see they live in harmony, but they still move around. Now, how do you ensure that the resources that are available, I'm not seeking an answer that will solve the problem now, but I'm seeking it for philosophical purposes. Yes. How do we work towards finding lasting solutions in these situations? Because the conflict that often arise, even among these communities, is resources.
Yeah. I think that's the question, and even as I think it's something for us to be pondering, even about as we go through. It is World Refugee Day, looking for a world where refugees are welcomed. I think is the message that came from Antonio Guterres' desk. And thank you for being part of this conversation, and it's definitely something that we can keep in mind as we continue these conversations. Jamin Kasuania is the Advocacy Manager of the International Rescue Committee, and Dorris Kawira, Hias Kenya County Director and Co-Chair of the NGO Refugee Group, have been our guests this hour.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.